Helldiver 12906 did not enjoy death. He didn't like to die. He didn't like to see other people die. That's why he became a doctor. Helldivers doctors had some of the best medical science known to man. Stims. That's why it was just so good that they had finally invented a pneumatic range delivery system for stims. Oh wait, no they hadn't. He really needed to get those multiple concussions checked out the next time he was on the ship. Probably nothing a little more stimulant couldn't fix. Reginald here. I'm finally excited to bring you part 2 of my advanced bot tutorial, which is to say something like a strategy, tactics, and philosophy guide. What matters is that I'm going to give you a set of tools you can add to your kit that will allow you to play in more different and interesting ways. Just like my last video, this video is carefully timestamped and there's a roadmap on screen below. Let's get into it. We are going to be discussing extraction in this video. I wanted to do a section on guerrilla warfare, but I think it'll have to wait for me to gather more information. So let's get into my favorite part first and lead off with a quote from The Art of War. In the 9 situations, the 9th situation is desperate ground. Sun Tzu said, "Ground on which we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay is desperate ground," which is really to say extraction is desperate ground. And you have to do it every mission, so let's figure out how to get good. Now, before anyone says it, I am aware you can stealth extractions, and I will get to that. For now, let's focus on the significantly more common, and decidedly fun, circumstance of needing to actually fight on extraction. Based on recommendations from my comments from my last video, I will be referencing the US Army Manual ADP 3-90, Offense and Defense, to help inform some ideas for this, but a good bit of it is just my thoughts as well. For our first chapter, I'm going to need to spend a few minutes talking about certain key mechanics that inform this and future topics. The first thing on the table is bot attention. Attention can be broken out into 3 categories: seeing, hearing, and knowing. In order to keep this brief, we're going to just use this as more of a primer. I won't get too specific. A bot can see what is in front of it within a certain angle, and they don't look around too much. Occasionally, one of them will cast their gaze around, but most often the majority of them will remain fixated forwards quite intently, even when marching. Not exactly head on a swivel, these bots. Their angle of vision appears to be something like 180 degrees, and I have tested this with some rigor. It might be more consistent at around 120 degrees, as others have said, but the footage on screen should be showing you what I mean. Behavior is not 100% consistent here, but here's a graphical rendition of what I have discovered. The Vile bot, and all its deviousness, generally mimics human visual acuity in that its detection radius is longest towards the center of its vision and smallest towards the edges. Umbrin, Aravan, and Cashcrop have all done work on this subject. Hearing behavior is of course 360 degrees, but has kind of difficult to intuitive ranges for different weapons. I didn't really test them all in this case. We'll save it for another video. But others have tested this, and surprisingly, guns like the Revolver and Plasma Scorcher are really quiet. Enemy behavior is what we care about here, so please note, if you shoot an enemy and it is killed, bots who hear the attack but cannot see its target will attempt to investigate the source of any sounds. That can be the enemy dying, the explosion from the munition, the backpack blowing up, or a report from your weapon. You'll have to play with this for your weapons particularly, or watch other tutorials for precise details, as this is not the core subject matter for this video. It's sufficient that you know sound matters and that enemies will approach sounds. Now, what do I mean by knowing? Well, anytime we talk about enemies, it's not uncommon to say something like, "Oh man, they know." And so that right there is precisely what I'm referring to. They may be soulless automatons, but it does give us a sense that the enemy has identified that we're there, that there's some sort of threat, and that they're reacting accordingly. I think this language is intuitive, so let's stick with it, even though I know it's really more like behavior states. The first behavior state is passive. Passive bots are just sitting around doing nothing, maybe marching on patrol, but they have no idea there are Helldivers around. 2. Alert. Alerted bots are actively searching for a possible threat. If they find sufficient evidence, whatever all of those criteria are, they will immediately attack and launch flares. 3. Engaged. An engaged bot never seems to necessarily retire, and may lose track of you, but will always know you're out there. Such enemies can be disengaged from, but never return to the passive state. As long as the bot knows of you and has seen you, it will track your position and keep track of where you are and where you were last seen. If they know, they know. And once they know, they don't stop knowing. They're going to start behaving differently, and they have different detection radiuses. So really, it's only when you get those first encounters that they don't know. This leads directly into the subject of aggro. A bot that is engaged is in a binary state of aggro on, but may not have the capacity to find or attack you. Thus, the bot might search for you for a time or retire to another position. Otherwise, it will target any available Helldiver if you're not available. What matters to you is understanding that bots can temporarily lose aggro on everyone or direct aggro to someone other than you. This can allow you to run away or take a flanking action as appropriate to your situation. Equally important is the fact that bots can know where you were last seen. This is why bots will rain death on your cover and will pre-fire corners that you might have peeked recently. Bots will fire at your last exposed position consistently, leading to a suppressing fire-like effect. All of these details will be relevant in our discussions ahead, so please keep them in mind. But I'm going to go ahead and insert a tip real quick right here. Don't keep peeking the same corner over and over. You're gonna get blasted. It's just that simple. Did you know that all the extraction terrains are handcrafted and repeated as tiles? Thus, it is possible for you to see the same exact extraction tile over and over again over time. In theory, it would be possible for you and some friends to put together a list of all the extraction tiles and concoct battle plans for each one. Could be a fun way to play, but I would remind you that no plans survive first contact with the enemy, which is why the second characteristic of the defense listed by the ADP 390 is flexibility. Defensive operations require flexible plans that anticipate enemy actions and allocates resources accordingly. Commanders shift the main effort as required. They plan battle positions in depth and the use of reserves in spoiling attacks and counterattacks. The other characteristics of the defense are disruption, maneuver, mass and concentration, operations in depth, preparation, and security. Every action you're going to be taking in a Helldivers mission is by definition hasty. You may have a little time to prepare, but in general, you're not going to have a lot. But I want you to remember, what we're attempting to do here is generate some principles of thought that you can leverage in your game to do better than you were doing before. Let's look at a hypothetical extraction scenario. You have to hold this area. You probably recognize it. So you've called an extraction. You know you want to fight in extraction. You're not going to try and hide. And you know you need to stay within at least 50 meters of extraction, otherwise it will cancel. So where are you going to pick to stand? Well, one mechanic you might want to know right off the bat if you're going to be doing an extraction that's going to be combat oriented is once you call an extraction, all the patrols in the nearby area and possibly some spawns will rush in to try and investigate the extraction beacon. If they get bored, they will leave. That's ultimately how stealthing is done. You stay out of vision radius until they leave. But since we're going to be fighting this, we're going to want to pick a time to engage. Thus, if we stand around in the open, we're not going to get to choose when to engage. The enemy will just engage on us as soon as they arrive. If you're random queuing, that might be exactly what happens. But it's possible for you to pick a position where nobody gets seen, and if you all lay down, you might be able to avoid conflict until you're ready to launch essentially an ambush. Might I recommend my previous video, which includes a discussion on the L-shaped ambush. Well, one of the difficult things about these kinds of extractions is that the enemy is going to be coming at us from an indeterminate number of directions simultaneously, potentially with an indeterminate number of enemies. So we're going to want to pick a good fighting position for ourselves that considers the terrain, cover, and funneling of incoming enemies. That's where this overview shot that I showed earlier is going to come in pretty handy. Let's take a look. Let's add a little bit of detail with some lines. The red lines represent movement blocking terrain, while the blue lines represent terrain that can block incoming fire and line of sight. A few of these smaller enemies won't be able to go over some of this blue terrain, but it's not really key to the discussion here, so we're going to leave that alone. This next image might be a little bit more helpful for helping us pick a position, since we now know what the terrain can be like after some damage. This is after about 1380 and maybe a 120. Notice how there's no buildings anymore, and nothing in the center, and there's only a few shipping containers to the left. We've even lost some of the shipping containers. It is fully possible to lose all of the shipping containers in this territory. That's what you can see here with the remaining lines. And it's worth mentioning that the only places where the blue bars are on the inside of the red lines are where you can stand on top of this sort of raised terrain and actually fire at the enemy while also still having cover for yourself. That means that entire left side becomes exposed. Now, not everything can destroy all of these terrain features, but it doesn't take that long for bots to start being able to with the kind of things they bring to the table in a level 9, and certainly your artillery will do a lot of damage too. So knowing all these details about the terrain and how it's going to decay over the course of your battle, you're probably going to pick the same place to stand that everyone naturally gravitates to, which is this place. Hooray, I've done it. I've managed to state the obvious. But then, science is made up of so many things that appear obvious after they are explained. Dr. Pardo Kynes, father of Dr. Liette Kynes, Dune. This picking where we stand bit was actually an exercise that's somewhat important. See, what I did is I dragged you through picking where you stand based on the terrain and the terrain over the course of the mission. I let you pick the final position you'd like to occupy after everything gets destroyed, because that's actually going to be called a strong point. This is from the section in the ADP 390 on battle positions. There are 5 kinds of battle positions: the primary position, the alternate position, the supplementary position, the subsequent position, and a strong point position. Since we can't do much preparation in this game, we're going to generally have 1, maybe 2 strong points, and they're going to be based on terrain that can't be destroyed over the course of the battle. From here, though, we can start to imagine other ways to defend than just standing in the strong point the whole battle. It may make sense for you to pick a primary position that is out front, somewhere amongst the buildings. As things get too hot, you may wish to move to an alternate position in the shipping container area in order to continue firing on the territory you were attacking before. If you are able to break line of sight from the enemy, they may distribute aggro somewhere else, allowing you to fight at them from an unexpected side flank, even though you've only moved just a little bit. As the terrain decays, you may wish to move back to your subsequent position that you've already decided on in order to continue your fight. Typically, when it comes to this particular tile set, I tend to oscillate around the back edges of the strong point, fighting from corner to corner at different times. When things start to get too hot, when I start to get too much pre-firing on the position that I'm fighting from, I maneuver to a new one and just take a different angle of attack. In my experience when pubbing, my pubs tend to be a bit more stationary. They post up in a spot and tend to maneuver around loosely in that area, hoping that the spot they've picked is as excellent as possible. By maneuvering the way I maneuver, I tend to surprise the enemy from flanking positions and occasionally get access to that fabulous
enfilade
fire. And when I say surprise, I am really referring back to that concept of attention that I was discussing earlier. The bots can be looking at other things and you can actually get the drop on them. So I've introduced you to the concept of battle positions and a couple different kinds, all of which are essentially what they sound like. Let's talk about a few other things you can do to make this a bit more sophisticated as a defense, even as a solo player queuing randomly with randoms. I want to introduce you to the concept of defense in depth. What is that? Well, FM 390 describes it as follows. Units normally prefer to perform a defense in depth. Forces defending in depth absorb the momentum of enemy attacks by making enemy forces attack repeatedly through a series of mutually supporting positions. Building these positions requires significant time and engineer support to increase the survivability and countermobility of these positions. Depth gives fire support assets time to deliver effects on multiple locations against selected enemies of the attacking enemy force. Depth provides more reaction time for defending forces to respond by repositioning or counterattacking. Units continuously employ their information collection assets to gather additional information about the attacking enemy's intentions and capabilities between the time combat starts and the time the enemy commits to a COA. Depth reduces the risk of enemy forces rapidly penetrating the MBA along unexpected directions. Well, if that doesn't sound like corporate jargon to you, it sounds like corporate jargon to me, so let's just simplify this down. Defense in depth is literally just a tower defense game, but in real life. Fight me. Only you'd lose, because your argument balloons are never going to make it through my field of dangerous monkeys with darts. And to prove the point, you know that new defense they added recently? The one with the brick wall as the icon? That is also essentially, in every conceivable way, a tower defense, and you can serve as the towers as much as your literal deployable turrets. It's also literally the perfect example of defense in depth. It has a number of fortifications, you can construct and in place more, you can close the gates, and the whole time you're holding out as you trade space for time as you move back through each of the set of gates. The more people and material you have, the more complex you can make this, of course, as you overlap fields of fire and artillery positions and yada yada, but the simplistic version of this is you are going to take a position, you are going to fall back to a new but sensible position that you've planned out ahead of time ideally, and are using to then fight from, and you'll fall back to another position to fight from. That's basically what you as an individual can do, only there's a little more that you can do, actually, because you have stratagems. Planning the positioning of defensive stratagems like turrets, minefields, in relation to yourself allows you to mimic a small version of a defense in depth by yourself. Furthermore, if you can leverage your team, you can do even more of this. Just depends on how many people you're able to work with to get your job done. But there is in fact a superordinal version of this concept that you can leverage here. Just because you can't build a bunch of machine gun nests doesn't mean you can't do a defense in depth in your circumstances. Defense in depth has been used as a higher level concept for cybersecurity. It's quite common, in fact. You can do the same thing simply by keeping track of and observing the usage of stratagems that are offensive, such as artillery strikes, eagles, and laser orbitals, etc. Time itself can be a layer in your defense in depth strategy, and as such, your offensive and defensive stratagems and their timers are all part of your strategy for making an effective defense. Thus, ideally, you should not start your extraction if you have time to wait a little bit until you are actually ready to initiate your extraction and have a good number of your strategies stratagems on standby. Then you should keep track of who is throwing their stratagems when so that you can stagger them out and maximize their utility over the course of the battle. You don't want to blow them all at the start and then have none for when things get spicy. The final chapter in this video is on preparation. In Helldivers, let's be honest, there's usually not a lot of time to set anything up, and most extractions are the literal definition of a hasty area defense. However, there are some things you can do to improve your defensive odds, and get prepared beforehand. The ADP 390 reads preparation as follows. Defending units prepare their areas of operation before attacking enemy forces arrive, or they establish the defense behind a force performing a security operation. Commanders employ forward and flank security forces to protect their defending forces from surprise and reduce the unknowns in any situation. Defending forces study the terrain, study enemy forces, and prepare engagement areas. They combine natural and man-made obstacles to canalize attacking forces into those engagement areas. Defending forces place information collection assets throughout their areas of operation to provide intelligence and early warning of enemy actions. They position combat multipliers such as fires and sustainment assets to support their defensive plans. Defending forces improve the survivability of their units by constructing field fortifications, using camouflage, and dispersing. Defending forces continue rehearsals and preparations until close combat begins. Suffice it to say, most of that isn't relevant to our situation, but I will use what I can from this to give you some examples of what might be useful to you. While it's not always ideal to do so, on some maps and on some occasions, it's perfectly reasonable to land near or on extraction. You can then observe the tile set that it is, if there's any enemies there, and if you need to clear it out ahead of time. That would be one way to prepare. Furthermore, once you know what tile set you're going to be dealing with, you'll be able to sketch out in your mind a few good fighting positions and maybe work out a plan with your friends. As a companion to this point, I think as the game becomes more familiar to everyone, there is going to be, despite what I said earlier, a sort of trend towards a normalized, standardized approach for handling each extraction tile that will be silently agreed upon by all the players because it's just sort of the way everyone does things. That's to say, a meta will probably develop around each extraction tile, and as that develops, you'll start to find these more fluid and easier to deal with without having to communicate with actual teams to set them up. Now, I'm not saying you need to create a very deep battle plan to make that work for you or your friends, but you can create a sketch battle plan, and to that extent, having a sense of where you're going to stand for your primary and then your alternate and subsequent positions in a given tile set is going to be something that becomes second nature to you, and as a consequence, it will be a lot easier to go, okay, I've observed the terrain that I'm going to be fighting on, I know more or less what I want to do on that, and as that part of the process becomes more automated, we can start to sink into some efficiencies. Now, I recently finished the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Pretty good book. I recommend it. In that book, he describes how 1% efficiencies can be used to maximize advantage and give you the win in a professional bike race. So despite the fact that there is an expanding list of defensive stratagems at our disposal, and we will see more that can give us bigger advantages, I'm going to be looking at some small advantages we can always use that are not especially dependent on our stratagem selection. First on my list would be simply tossing in your first supply drop stratagem into extraction at the start of your mission. This kicks off the timer so that you'll have it pretty soon by the time you get to your next objective, and 2, it'll actually give you the advantage of having the supply pack sitting on extraction ready to go, and then being able to typically drop another one, thus doubling the number of stims, grenades, and ammunition you have access to. The grenades being the biggest thing. Item 2. A common practice for Helldivers who have arrived at their extraction and are about to launch it is to chuck down all of their weapons stratagems. A more useful way to do this is to line them up in a particular choke point to slow the enemy and block their fire. This can even distract hulks temporarily. If your goal is to buy time, that's time 1. Item 3. Clearing out any unnecessary trees, foliage, or cover that an enemy could use when attacking your position. If you have good sightlines on your particular extraction point, like this one, but it's being spoiled by thick, dense trees, it might be worthwhile to actually clear those out of the way. You might want to do that before you do your call in or during, depending on your circumstances, but just keep that in mind. Item 4. A tip for you that you can leverage is that some terrain, including the ground, is destructible, and the right explosive weapons can dig holes, trenches even. The Eruptor is especially good for this. Case in point, this terrain is largely just flat and winding, and mostly you have to use the defilades from standing behind the hill to prevent you from getting shot. By digging a trench here and there, you can actually add some new terrain that's quite safe to stand behind. Last thing I'll say here is this topic is dense. We could spend a lot of time on it. I hope I've been able to do so in an efficient manner for you, and I hope you had some fun in the meantime. I did watch someone I want to tell you about. HaebyungDance is a YouTuber who talks about an entirely other game. He made some really excellent content on this subject, and if you're looking for more and want more detailed breakdown of some of these concepts and a little bit more information on how to use them, I really recommend going and watching that video. I will link it in my description below, and if you happen to stop by, hey, I liked your stuff. I don't even play your game. With that, I will simply say, have a lovely day. Thank you all so much for visiting. Bye-bye.